Cocytus is well known for having the best defensive capabilities, given his almost maxed out physical attacks and numerous powerful skills, weapons, and abilities. But as we already know, that doesn't necessarily translate to being the strongest out of the Floor Guardians. There are many methods that each of them can use to gain the upper edge if they were to ever fight him. Even so, the fact that Cocytus was once able to deal damage to Albedo in the past is certainly something worth looking into. So let's take a closer look at everything from his race and job classes to the skills and abilities that come with it. And hopefully by the end, we'll have an answer to the video's title question of how strong is Cocytus. But first, this video is sponsored by Brick's Breaker Quest, a simple yet entertaining free-to-play mobile puzzle game bringing its own style to the brick breaker genre. Designed to operate well either on your tablet or your phone, where you can passively play with one hand if need be. And with thousands of stages to play through and multiple different game modes including both online multiplayer and offline gameplay, there's definitely plenty of features to keep you occupied. Not to mention unlockable achievements and a global leaderboard to keep track of how you stack up against everyone else. Then, even with its clean retro neon style, you can still buy different ball skins or ball types to add that extra level of customization. So, if you want to check this game out, then feel free to use the link in the description to download Brick's Breaker Quest for free today. Now, let's get back to the video. Let's start with his race. Cocytus is a member of an unknown insectoid race that blends features from multiple different types of insects together. This includes multiple arms, large mandibles, a scorpion-like tail, and a tough exoskeleton. 30 of his levels are distributed into his racial classes, split between a total of 3 different types, meaning an insectoid in Yggdrasil is classified as a heteromorph, one of the 3 main race types that a player can choose upon character creation. In case you don't remember, as a heteromorph, Cocytus has access to a robust racial class tree in addition to his normal job class tree, and this would allow him to literally morph into a new creature as he takes levels in more advanced racial classes, kind of like how a Pokemon evolves into a stronger form. As a result, heteromorphs can have multiple racial levels in multiple different classes, which is opposed to demi-humans who can only have 1 or 2 classes, or humanoids who cannot have levels in races at all. As for Cocytus' specific build, the level distribution includes 10 in Insect Fighter, 10 in Vermin Lord, and a further 10 unknown, bringing us to the aforementioned total of 30 racial class levels. Now, if I had to guess, the 10 that are unknown are likely put into his primary race, while Insect Fighter and Vermin Lord are the evolutionary forms of it, especially since they don't seem to refer to any specific type of insect. They're rather just broad descriptors of insectoid elements. In fact, it's possible that all playable insect characters in Yggdrasil were derived from the same base insect race, perhaps called something like insect. For instance, the Pleiades Antoma, one of the other insect creatures, has only 12 racial class levels, 2 of which are unknown and 10 of which are simply arachnoid. So this could infer that first you would have to select the base insect class, then the class after would be the type of insect you want. This isn't something that's just isolated with Antoma or Cocytus either though. Similarly, one of the 5 worst Kyohuko also has 2 unknown insect levels, then more levels in a class called Insect Druid, which sounds remarkably similar to Cocytus' Insect Fighter. It's almost like both of them started with the same base insect race, and then for their next racial class they had a choice between things like Insect Fighter, Insect Druid, Insect Ranger, and so on. Then, depending on which form they picked and how far up they progressed, they would end up with radically different appearances and capabilities. So personally, we believe this type of character progression is the most likely since, honestly, it's really difficult to pick out what kind of insect race Cocytus is just from looking at him. I mean, first we see he has beetle-like features, similar to that of the Japanese rhinoceros beetle, which really fits his character motif since its name in Japanese is the KABUTO beetle, a reference to a particular kind of Japanese helmet possessed by samurai. Something the samurai-obsessed Takuma Kazuchi would definitely go for when creating an NPC. The thing about the KABUTO beetle though is that they're named after their particularly notable head, a feature that Cocytus clearly doesn't resemble. Not to mention that there's all the other features too, like his scorpion-like tail, his bipedal mantis-like movements, and the ant-like mandibles. So, like I said, maybe all insects are part of one big happy insect race, then you can mix and match whatever crazy appearance you want after. However, it is still possible that there are many base insect races, each with their own unique sets of abilities. With this format, these races would then follow the more standard RPG format, and they would share a lot of derivative races like Insect Fighter or Insect Druid, which any insect type race could ultimately freely pick. kind of like how both a human and an elf can become wizards. In fact, there appear to be quite a few racial classes which are mirrors of job classes, though this is generally more common for the demi-human races rather than the heteromorphs. For example, goblins can get racial classes in Goblin Cleric or Goblin Mage, but they can also get formal training and level up the job classes of Wizard and Cleric. Thematically speaking, these racial classes tend to be more primitive in nature and relate more to the innate inborn talent of the race in question, whereas job classes require something akin to formal education and training in a civilized society. This is yet another mechanic that was borrowed from Dungeons & Dragons. In the case of an insect fighter like Cocytus, that means it would share some basic similarities with the normal fighter class that humanoid races had access to, but with large portions of it adapted towards insect life, culture, and morphology. Speaking of Cocytus' insect fighter, the fighter name is actually a direct reference to one of the core classes in Dungeons & Dragons, the fighter. As a core class, a fighter was meant to be extremely flexible, allowing the player to build it into almost any kind of combat specialist they could think of. Pretty much all of the classes, features, and abilities were user selected, in the sense that they could specialize in pretty much anything. Dual wielding, archery, mounted combat, disarming, multi-hit attacks, shield-based offense and defense, whatever, you name it. If it involves combat, then you could probably specialize in it. Now, while most classes could access most of these features to one extent or another, the fighter was special in the sense that it could choose more of them than any of the other classes. More importantly, the fighter was also often a weapons expert. They could choose a single kind of weapon, like a longsword or a heavy mace, and they would gain buffs to accuracy, damage, or other stats while using it. This latter part is probably the most iconic aspect of fighters in Dungeons & Dragons, primarily because it was one of their only exclusive features, and thus it is the class feature most likely to have been borrowed by Maruyama for fighters in Overlord. However, that's not our focus. We're trying to figure out the insect fighter race class, not a generic fighter job class. Yes, fighters in general are weapons specialists, but there's something unique about insects and other heteromorphs that you wouldn't see from a regular fighter. It's what's known as natural gear. They're natural weapons and armor. Natural gear is a mechanic that basically entails any kind of weapon or armor that is innate to the creature, like a powerful exoskeleton or some sharp claws. It has several major advantages over regular gear. For one, it doesn't drop upon the user's death, so you won't have to worry about replacing it if you, say, accidentally died while raiding an enemy guild. For another, improving them was considerably cheaper than manufactured equipment of equivalent power. Like all weapons, they had a data crystal capacity that determined the number of special abilities that could be added to them. But by being a part of the user's body, natural equipment would grow more powerful as one leveled up. It was much easier than having to find these certain requisite item drops needed to upgrade regular equipment. Finally, they didn't need to be repaired, since healing spells would restore any damage they accrued. This meant that opponents who specialized in sunder abilities designed to target and destroy the opponent's equipment would be ineffective, as a simple healing spell could fix the problem. This also meant that they could be worn indefinitely, unlike regular equipment which suffered degradation over time and in battle. It even eliminates the time the user would normally have to spend either repairing their armor or swapping it out for a new set of equipment. In exchange for these advantages though, natural gear came with 4 important disadvantages. First, in order to be acquired, they required dedicated racial levels. Most humanoid and even demi-human races couldn't acquire them, meaning they were restricted to specific classes and races. On top of this, you had to sacrifice levels in other potentially useful classes in order to further acquire, specialize, and improve them. This is related to the second drawback of natural equipment. They were generally worse than top-of-the-line manufactured gear. It was almost impossible for natural gear to be the equivalent of custom-made divine quality gear. Doing even that much would undoubtedly require a very specialized build. In general, most natural gear peaked at around legendary quality, which meant that if one's opponent had farmed up a set of divine gear, then they'd have a noticeable advantage in stats. The third restriction was that one could not stack both natural gear and manufactured gear, meaning you couldn't wear armor over top your exoskeleton, and you couldn't use your claws while holding a sword. You could still wear accessories like rings, cloaks, and necklaces though. Now, finally, and arguably the most important limitation was that natural equipment could not be swapped around easily like regular equipment. You see, most players only pulled out their most expensive and valuable equipment when they were sure that they wouldn't lose it on death. So, general adventuring was typically performed with equipment that was 1 or 2 steps down in quality from your go-to and most valuable set of gear. and it was highly customary to swap between different sets of lower tier items, especially since it was much easier to obtain several sets of lower tier equipment for the same cost as a single set of higher tier equipment. As a result, players built custom sets designed for specific situations, like how the cloak Ainz wore into battle against Shaltir in Season 1 was built to maximize his holy damage resistance at the expense of his fire damage resistance. Now, all of these limitations together meant that you would only see investments in natural equipment on very specific builds, and committing to such was a very major decision. Let's use Shaltir as an example. Her fingernails are a natural weapon possessed by a vampire. In her case, these natural weapons were relatively inconsequential as she possessed the divine quality weapon, the Spewit Lance, though her fingernails were still durable enough to parry Brain Unglaus's attacks. Even so, it's unlikely Pararonchino invested heavily into using her claws as an actual weapon in battle. It's more likely the claws were acquired incidentally from taking levels in vampire-related classes. In Cocytus' case, his natural equipment comes in the form of his thick armor-like exoskeleton that's covered in icy spikes. Given that this is Cocytus' fully leveled form, it's clear warrior Takamikazuchi had made the decision to invest very heavily into it, especially since it has to act as Cocytus' primary source of protection, replacing any armor that he could have otherwise worn. As such, it's likely around as tough as a set of legendary class armor, but still not quite that divine level. We do know for sure that it is at least comparable with the rest of the melee combat guardians, Sebas and Albedo. Even if he does have the lowest defenses among the three, melee fighters must have much more survivability than any other kind of build, since they do have to close in on an enemy and engage them at a close range, thus increasing the amount of attacks that will be directed towards them. That said, we don't know much about its defensive capabilities. What we do know is that not only is Cocytus immune to cold damage, he is also outright immune to damage from lower tier weapons and magic of low tier spells, an ability very similar to the dragons that we saw Nabe fight against in Season 1. It's entirely possible that some or even all of these features were provided by his exoskeleton, though he could have acquired this immunity from other accessories or from specific class features. I mean, immunity to such spells was seemingly quite common amongst both players and the NPCs that they created, likely to protect against foes who relied on summoning large quantities of weak monsters to overwhelm their opponent. Even Ainz possesses the ability to outright ignore all damage from any foe below level 60. However, this is due to one of his undead racial class features, and not attributed to his gear. In any case, we theorize that acquiring and improving natural weapons and armor required one to take associated race class levels in things like Insect Fighter or advanced racial insectoid ones that specialized in improving melee combat. Insects devoted to spellcasting like Kyohuko would naturally have a less durable exoskeleton, since they weren't expected to be on the front lines, and as such, avoided classes like Insect Fighter. But Takamikazuchi would definitely want and need to select classes like that for Cocytus' melee-oriented build. We also suspect his tail counts as a natural weapon too, as he does use it in battle against the Lizardmen, though it isn't specifically confirmed in the light novel that it actually had counted as one in the game. Regardless, he does have multiple arms for equipping multiple weapons, so even if his tail is a natural weapon, it's likely that warrior Takamikazuchi didn't bother to invest or improve it very much. Alternatively, his use of the tail as a weapon could have been something that developed during the transition from Yggdrasil to the New World. After all, many things have changed, from mechanics like friendly fire to the fact that NPCs are now thinking, sometimes breathing, living beings, instead of mindless script-based NPCs. The fact that Cocytus can use his tail as a weapon could be a natural extension of him gaining sentience, especially if the video game NPC he was before didn't have the capability. Now, as for his 10 levels in Vermin Lord, well, that name fits right at home with the samurai theme. Lords in Japanese fantasy and fiction are often depicted possessing great skill and ability in battle. After all, as we mentioned in the last video, in the Sengoku period of Japanese history, Lord might as well have been synonymous with Warlord, and thus it was practically a requirement to be a master of warfare. So it could be that a Vermin Lord is a powerful warrior class available to those of insectoid races that would provide even more powerful abilities than a typical insect fighter. However, it has been briefly alluded to multiple times that Cocytus also has a number of insectoid minions under his command, some of which are actually quite high level. For instance, many of the creatures who were with him alongside Entoma while he was leading the expedition against the Lizardmen were his minions, and they are in fact supposed to be a higher level than Entoma. It's possible that much like Aura, Kyohuko, Antoma, Demiurge, and so on, that some of his classes would allow him to summon or control creatures. I mean, given the commanding nature of its name, Vermin Lord would be a perfect title for such a class. However, we can't rule out the possibility that these minions are more akin to Shalter's Vampire Brides or Demiurge's 7 Evil Lords, aka mercenary monsters, beings acquired through magic contracts that would expend gold in exchange for their indefinite services. These creatures would then be assigned as Cocytus' minions through some kind of footnote in his biography page. Then, when Nazarick was transported out of the video game Yggdrasil and into the New World, they became his actual minions. Ultimately, his title as given by warrior Takamakazuchi is the Ruler of the Frozen Glacier, which is the name for the 5th floor of Nazarick. So perhaps Takamakazuchi meant to allude to the idea that he leads an army of insect creatures who live on his floor. In any case, as you would expect from the warrior Cocytus, he is fairly chummy with most of his insect minions. It is well known that Cocytus is good friends with most of the insectoids of Nazarick, including Kyohuko and Goshokokuchuo of the 5 worst. Although there is one notable exception, and that is for Antoma, who is infamously known amongst the insect denizens of Nazarick as the Familiar Eater, stemming from her habit of snacking on other insects. But more on her when we start the video series on the Pleiades. Anyway, that's everything related to his racial classes. Next would be his 70 levels and job classes, which is honestly a whole nother monster that will be tackled separately in the next video, especially considering that that's where a lot of his named abilities come from, leaving room for a significant amount of speculation into their origins and what exactly they do. So be sure to join me next time as we get a better picture of Cocytus' overall build and abilities and move closer to answering the question in the title of how strong he is. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Bricksbreaker Quest once again for sponsoring this video. Don't forget that you can use the link in the description to download the game for free and start playing today. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!